He came to rob her cabin, but found a crying baby and a note that broke him. What if a man, hollowed out by the world until only greed and regret remained, stumbled not upon the gold he sought, but upon the one thing that could make him whole again? What if a soul, already at its breaking point, was pushed one step further, not into the abyss, but into the arms of an unlikely salvation? This is the story of Jedediah, a man running from his shadow, who rode into the heart of a merciless desert to rob a desolate cabin. He was a thief looking for a score, a ghost haunted by a past he couldn't outrun. But in that dusty, silent shack, he found no silver, no money, no worldly goods worth taking. Instead, he found a wailing baby, a desperate note, and a choice that would either shatter the last fragments of his soul or piece it back together, stronger than before. The desert wind was a thief itself, stealing the moisture from a man's lips and the hope from his heart. Jedediah felt it as a physical presence, a constant sandpaper rasp against the sun-cracked leather of his skin. His horse, a weary beast named Dust, plodded onward, its head low, defeated by the endless expanse of ochre and burnt sienna. Ahead, shimmering in the heat haze, was the promise of nothing, a dilapidated cabin, a speck of human folly against the indifferent canvas of the wastes. It was exactly what he was looking for. A place isolated enough to hold a few meager provisions, a forgotten stash, anything to get him another 50 miles away from the memory of Silas and a life he'd left in flames. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft, hot sand. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whine of the wind around the cabin's decaying timbers. He didn't bother knocking. The door was swollen in its frame, but his shoulder, hardened by years of similar work, made short work of the jamb. It splintered with a pathetic crack, and he stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The air was stale, thick with the scent of poverty and despair. A single room, a packed earth floor, a rough-hewn table with one chair, a pallet of straw and thin blankets in the corner. It was a place of profound emptiness, a monument to shattered dreams. A surge of bitter disappointment washed over him. He'd risked the last of his water on this. He kicked at a loose floorboard in frustration, the sound echoing in the oppressive quiet. There was nothing here. He turned to leave, his heart a cold, hard stone in his chest. And then he heard it, not the wind, not the groaning of the wood. It was a sound so out of place in this dead land that it felt like a hallucination. A thin, reedy cry, weak but insistent. Jedediah froze, every muscle tensed. His hand went to the Colt at his hip, a reflex born of a life where any unexpected sound was a prelude to violence. He scanned the room again, his gaze moving past the meager furniture to a small wooden crate tucked into the darkest corner, partially covered by a moth-eaten shawl. The cry came again, a little stronger this time, a desperate plea for comfort in a world that offered none. Slowly, cautiously, he approached the crate. He half expected a trapped animal, a coyote pup perhaps. He reached down and pulled back the shawl, his breath caught in his throat. Lying on a bed of folded flour sacks was a baby. Its face was red and blotchy from crying, its tiny fists balled in distress. It couldn't be more than a few months old. It was a life, impossibly small and fragile, in the very heart of death. Beside the infant's head lay a folded piece of paper, a letter. Jedediah's calloused fingers, more accustomed to the cold steel of a gun than the delicate texture of paper, trembled slightly as he picked it up. His world, which he thought had already shrunk to the simple, brutal equation of survival, was about to be irrevocably, terrifyingly expanded. Jedediah unfolded the paper, his eyes squinting in the dim light filtering through the cracked doorframe. The handwriting was a woman's, elegant but unsteady, the strokes telling a story of haste and trembling hands. He began to read, the words a silent testament to a world of pain he had stumbled into. "To whoever finds this," it began, and Jedediah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert's eventual cool. "My name is Elara. My husband Thomas is gone. The fever took him last spring, and with him the strength to keep this place from the dust. We came here for a new start, but this land gives nothing back. My husband's family and dusty old redemption turned me out. Sayada was a curse. I have nowhere left to go." Jedediah read on, a knot tightening in his gut. He knew redemption. A town of pious hypocrites and grasping hands. He could picture them, their judgmental eyes, casting out a grieving widow. The letter continued, each word a drop of pure desperation. "The well has run dry. For 3 days there has been nothing. My milk is failing. I cannot let my daughter, my Rose, perish here. There is one last chance. The old maps call it Catcher's Creek, a day's walk east. They say it never runs dry. I have to try. I have taken the last of the water for the journey. I leave my Rose here, in the hope that I will return with life for us both." Jedediah's gaze drifted from the paper to the tiny squirming infant in the crate. The letter's final lines were a direct blow to the hardened shell he built around his heart. "Rose, a flower in the dust. If I do not return by the second sundown, I am gone. The desert has claimed me. Please, I beg of you, do not leave her. Take my Rose to the mission in San Alvo. It is a week's ride south. She is all that is good in this world. She is my love. Please, God have mercy. Tell them she is an orphan of the wastes." Jedediah's hand, holding the note, dropped to his side, to steal what little a person might have to fuel his own escape. The paper felt impossibly heavy. San Alvo, a week's ride, through this. He looked at the child, whose cries had softened to whimpers. A baby was a lead weight tied to a drowning man. It was an anchor. It was a death sentence. He had come here to take. His plan was simple: get supplies, ride north, and disappear into the territories where the name Silas meant nothing. A man with blood on his hands and a bounty on his head. But he wasn't a monster. Not yet. A baby wasn't part of the plan. A memory, sharp and unwelcome as a knife's edge, lanced through him another child. A boy with wide, trusting eyes, a fire, and his own failure to act quickly enough. He shook his head, trying to dislodge the ghost. He couldn't. The baby, Rose, began to cry again, a raw, hungry sound that echoed in the emptiness of the cabin and the hollowness of his own chest. He was a thief, a drifter. With a sigh that seemed to pull up the last dregs of his resolve, he looked around the cabin. He found a small tin of goat's milk powder and a nearly clean rag. He mixed the powder with a careful measure of water from his own canteen, a sacrifice that felt more significant than any gold he'd ever lost. His large, rough hands, scarred from a life of violence and labor, were clumsy as he dipped the rag and brought it to the baby's lips. She latched on immediately, her small mouth working with a fierce, desperate strength. As he held the rag, his knuckle brushed her cheek. Her skin was impossibly soft. A warmth spread through his chest, an unfamiliar, aching sensation. Her eyes, wide with shock and exhaustion, fixed on the sight of a grim, armed stranger holding her child. In that moment, watching the child feed, a silent vow was made. He didn't know how, but he wouldn't leave her. He would take her to San Alvo. Just as that new, terrifying purpose solidified in his mind, the cabin door, already broken and ajar, creaked open wider. A figure stood silhouetted against the blinding glare of the afternoon sun, stumbling, frail. It was a woman. Her clothes were torn, her face gaunt and blistered by the sun. It was Elara. She had returned. A strangled cry escaped her lips, and then, her strength utterly gone, she collapsed onto the dirt floor in a dead faint. The world swam back to Elara in fractured pieces. The first was thirst, a desperate, clawing need that felt like swallowing hot sand. The second was the cool, metallic taste of water on her cracked lips, a miracle she hadn't dared to pray for. The third, and most jarring, was the face of the man leaning over her. He was a stranger, his face a landscape of hard lines and sun-weathered grit, a dark stubble clinging to his jaw. Fear, sharp and electrifying, shot through her. She tried to scramble back, her mind screaming one word, Rose. Her eyes darted wildly around the dim cabin until they found the crate. Her baby was asleep, her small chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. The man had a canteen in his hand. He had given her his water. He hadn't hurt her child. The fear didn't vanish, but it was joined by a profound, dizzying confusion. Easy now, he said, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. He didn't move closer, giving her space, his posture betraying a cautious respect, not aggression. He gestured with his chin toward the crate. Found your note. Alara pushed herself into a sitting position, her body screaming in protest. Catcher's Creek had been a lie, a cruel trick of a faded map. Just another sun-bleached wash of sand and rock. The journey back had been a delirium of failure, each step a surrender to the inevitable. She had returned to the cabin only to die beside her daughter. She looked at the man, this thief who had broken her door, and saw not a predator, but the instrument of an impossible reprieve. You gave her ... She started, her voice a dry rasp. She was hungry, he stated, as if it were the simplest, most obvious fact in the world. He didn't mention he'd come to rob her. He didn't mention the bounty on his head, or the man who hunted him. In the stark honesty of the moment, those details seemed like lies. The truth was the sleeping child and the shared canteen of water. A tense, unspoken truce settled over the small room. The broken door served as a constant reminder of his violent entry, but his gentle actions since had begun to mend a different kind of breach. He was Jedediah, he told her. She was Alara. Names were exchanged like fragile currency, a first step toward trust in a place that had taught them both to be faithless. The sun set, painting the desert in hues of bruised purple and soft rose, and the immediate crisis of dehydration gave way to the chronic one of starvation. They were still trapped. Jedediah, however, was a creature of the harsh wilderness. He moved with a quiet competence that spoke of a long and difficult acquaintance with survival. He disappeared into the twilight and returned with 2 skinny jackrabbits, procured with snares made from scraps of wire he carried in his saddlebag. As he skinned them outside, Alara watched from the doorway, holding a now-awake Rose, whose curious eyes followed the man's every move. Later, the smell of roasting meat filled the small cabin, a scent of life and sustenance that was almost intoxicating. They ate in near silence, the only sounds the crackling of the small fire Jedediah had built in the hearth and Rose's soft gurgles. The firelight danced on their faces, softening the hard lines on his, illuminating the cautious hope in hers. It was a fragile domesticity, woven from threads of desperation and necessity, yet it felt more real than anything Alara had known in months. They were large, calloused, and scarred, the hands of a man who had known trouble. She watched his hands as he ate, but she had also seen those same hands mix milk for her daughter with a surprising gentleness. She saw him glance at Rose, a fleeting, protective look that he quickly hid when he caught her watching. One evening, a few days later, while she was mending a tear in his worn duster with a needle and thread she de-treasured, he sat by the fire, whittling a piece of scrap wood. He wasn't looking at her, but she knew his attention was on her, the child sleeping in her lap. The silence was comfortable now, a shared space rather than an empty one. He finished his work and held it out to her. It was a small, smoothly carved bird. He didn't say a word, just placed it in her free hand. The wood was still warm. It was a simple gift, an acknowledgment of their unspoken alliance. It was a promise, carved in wood, that for now they were in this together. In the heart of the desolate wastes, a family, fragile as a bird's wing, was beginning to form. The fragile peace of their small world was shattered by a speck on the horizon. It was Jedediah who saw it first. He had been on the small rise behind the cabin, checking his snares. He froze, his body going rigid, his eyes narrowing to slits against the morning glare. A rider, a lone horseman, moving with a predatory slowness, not the aimless wander of a lost traveler, but the patient, circling path of a wolf. Jedediah didn't need to see the man's face. He knew the way he sat a horse, the arrogant slump of his shoulders. It was Silas. The name was a foul taste in his mouth, a ghost from a past he had ridden 1,000 miles to bury. He scrambled back down to the cabin, his movements urgent, the quiet competence of the survivor replaced by the tense alertness of the hunted. Elara saw the change in him instantly. The cautious peace that had settled in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, familiar darkness. "What is it?" she asked, clutching Rose a little tighter. "Trouble," he said, his voice flat and hard. He went to the door, peering through a crack in the wood. "He figures I took his too. Man I used to know. His name is Silas." He didn't turn to look at her as he spoke, his focus entirely on the distant threat. "We rode together. Did things I ain't proud of. When I left, I took my share." The confession hung in the air, stark and ugly. This man, this Jedediah who had shown her such unexpected kindness, was an outlaw. A man with a history written in violence and theft. Every fear she had initially felt upon seeing him rushed back, cold and sharp. Was he just a different kind of danger? Had she traded the slow death of the desert for the swift violence of a gunfight? She looked from his rigid back to the sleeping face of her daughter. The world was full of monsters. But this ain't about a poster. This is personal. Some wore the face of the wild, and others the face of men. She had to choose her protector. Jedediah finally turned, and the look in his eyes was not that of a cold-blooded killer, but of a man cornered. He looked at her, then at Rose, and a profound weariness settled over him. "He's a bounty hunter now," Jedediah continued, his voice low. "He won't just pass by. He'll have seen the smoke from our fire. He'll have seen my horse. He knows I'm here. And he won't leave without settling his score." The external threat was no longer an abstract concept like starvation or dehydration. It had a name and a face, and it was riding directly toward them. The cabin, which had become a sanctuary, was now a trap. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. Her first instinct was to run, to grab Rose and disappear into the rocks, but she knew it was a fool's hope. The desert had already nearly claimed her once, and a man on horseback would run them down before they'd gone a mile. She looked at Jedediah again, really looked at him. She saw the outlaw, yes, but she also saw the man who had given her his last water, who had fed her. Child, who had carved a wooden bird with gentle, scarred hands. He hadn't lied to her, not about this. He was giving her the truth, brutal as it was, and with it, a choice. The distant rider was gone, vanished back into the heat shimmer, but his presence lingered like a venomous promise. Jedediah knew Silas's methods. He wouldn't make a direct assault in the light of day. He would wait. He would circle. He would let the heat and the fear do his work for him. Preparation became their prayer. "He'll try the windows first," Jedediah said, his voice a low, instructional hum. "We need to brace them." They worked as a seamless unit, their movements economical and synchronized. He tore boards from the already collapsing lean-to outside while she cleared space within. She passed him the hammer and nails her husband had left, her hand steady despite the tremor in her soul. He worked with a grim focus, his powerful arms driving nails into wood, turning their fragile shelter into a crude fortress. There was no wasted motion, no wasted words. Each action was a declaration of their shared will to survive. She watched him, marveling at the transformation. The quiet, almost gentle man who had whittled a toy for her daughter was gone, replaced by a hardened soldier preparing for battle. Yet the kindness was still there, underneath. When he handed her the heavy rifle, his hand brushed hers, a brief, grounding touch. "Just point and pull," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "Don't think about it. If he gets through, you just point and pull." He was not just preparing the cabin. He was preparing her, entrusting her with their collective life. As twilight began to bleed across the desert, casting long, menacing shadows, they sat by the hearth, the fire a small beacon of defiance against the coming dark. Rose slept soundly in her crate, oblivious to the mortal danger that surrounded them. Attention was a living thing in the room, thick and suffocating. In the flickering firelight, Alara found the courage to ask the question that had been hovering between them. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you stay? You could have taken what you needed and left. Left us." Jedediah stared into the flames, the light carving deep shadows into the planes of his face. He was silent for a long time, wrestling with words he wasn't used to forming. He had lived his life in the language of action, of survival, of violence. The language of the heart was foreign territory. "When I was young," he began, his voice raspy with disuse, "part of Silas's crew. We hit a homestead, supposed to be empty. It wasn't." He paused, the memory of physical weight on his shoulders. "A boy. Silas ... He didn't like witnesses. I was just a kid myself." I froze. "I did nothing. There was a family." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain so old it had become a part of him. "When I found her," he nodded towards Rose's crate, "and read your note. I saw that boy in my sleep for 10 years. I just ... I couldn't do nothing again. No one else was going to come for you. So I stayed." The confession was a key, unlocking the deepest chamber of his heart. She saw him then, not as an outlaw, but as a man desperately seeking redemption, a man trying to rewrite the ending of his own story. A profound empathy washed over her, erasing the last of her fear of him. It was her turn to offer a piece of her own broken past. "My husband, Thomas," she said softly. "He was a good man. A dreamer. He saw a paradise in this dust. I saw it too, through his eyes. When he died, the dream died with him. His family said I'd brought a blight on them. They said I was barren, and when Rose was finally born, they said she was a bad omen. I came out here to escape their judgment, but I was so lost." She looked down at her hands. "I was ready to let the desert take us both." She met his gaze, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You weren't just saving us from the sun, Jedediah. You were saving us from a world that had already thrown us away." In that shared moment of vulnerability, their bond, forged in crisis and tempered by quiet care, was solidified into something unbreakable. She walked over to the old rifle her husband had left propped in the corner. They were two outcasts, two broken souls who, in their shared solitude, had found the one thing neither had expected: a home. He was dangerous, but his danger had been turned outward, a shield against the world. Silas's danger was aimed inward, a poison meant to destroy. She made her decision. She didn't know much about using it, but she knew how to load it. She picked it up, her movements deliberate. "What do we need to do?" she asked, her voice steady. Jedediah looked at her, a flicker of surprise and something akin to gratitude in his dark eyes. The lines of their alliance, once tentative, were now drawn in steel. They were no longer two strangers bound by circumstance. They were a family facing down the storm together. The sun climbed higher, a merciless eye in the cloudless sky, baking the small cabin and the two souls trapped within. The night deepened, a vast, star-dusted blanket that offered no comfort, only concealment for the evil that crept closer. The silence was absolute, a taut wire stretched to its breaking point. Then, a voice cut through the darkness, smooth and cruel as oiled leather. "Jedediah? I know you're in there, old friend. Playing house, are we?" It was Silas. He was close. His voice seemed to come from all directions at once, a disembodied taunt carried on the night air. Jedediah stood motionless in the center of the cabin, his rifle held loosely at his side. His face was a mask of stone, but Elara could see the muscle twitching in his jaw. "I heard you went soft, Jed," the voice mocked, laced with a false camaraderie. "Never took you for the type. But I suppose a man gets lonely. What's her name? Does she know what you are? Does she know about the boy at Willow Creek? Does she know how you stood and watched?" Elara flinched. The words were poison darts, aimed at the old wound Jedediah had just confessed to her. She looked at him, expecting to see him crumble, but his gaze remained fixed, hard as flint. "And I hear you've got a little one in there, too," Silas purred, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more terrifying than a shout. "A new weakness, Jedediah. A new way to make you pay what you owe me." A horse snorted somewhere out in the darkness, the sound unnervingly close. Silas was circling them, a shark in the black water of the desert night. He was enjoying this, drawing it out, savoring their fear. The psychological assault was relentless. The heat inside the cabin was stifling, the air thick with the smell of sweat and dread. Rose stirred in her sleep, whimpering, as if sensing the malevolence that pressed in on them from all sides. Elara went to her, stroking her back, whispering soothing words she didn't feel herself. Her every instinct screamed at her to be silent, to hide, but her maternal love was a force more powerful than fear. Jedediah's eyes flickered towards her, a momentary softening in their hardened depths. Her quiet strength was a bulwark against Silas's venom. He wasn't alone with his ghosts this time. "It's not about the money anymore, is it, Jed? It's about the principle." You walked away. Silas called out, his tone changing, becoming more agitated. "You thought you could just wash your hands of us, of what we did. But the dirt doesn't come off that easy. It stains you. I'm just the stain coming to collect." A rock suddenly thumped against the newly braced window, making them both jump. It was a test, a probe of their defenses. Jedediah didn't react, didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. His silence was his weapon now, a refusal to engage in Silas's twisted game. He moved to the wall, pressing his ear against the wood, listening. He was no longer the haunted drifter. He was the protector, every sense honed, every nerve firing. He was a man with something to lose, and that made him infinitely more dangerous than Silas could possibly comprehend. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The taunts continued, a relentless stream of filth and memory designed to unman him, to break his spirit before the first shot was even fired. Elara held Rose, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on Jedediah's broad back. He was the wall between her and the horror outside. He was all they had. And as the moon crept higher, casting a pale, spectral light over the desert, she knew the waiting was almost over. The game was ending. The violence was about to begin. A flicker of orange light danced outside the small, grime-caked window. "Smells like burning, Jedediah." Silas's voice was triumphant, giddy with malice. "Hard to shoot straight when your house is on fire." The smell of smoke, sharp and acrid, began to seep through the cracks in the walls. Panic, cold and immediate, seized Elara. Fire was their greatest fear, a roaring beast that would consume their small fortress and drive them out into the open, into Silas's gun sights. Jedediah cursed under his breath, a low, guttural sound. "He's piled brush against the west wall. Stay here. Keep her down," he ordered, his voice tight with urgency. He grabbed the half-empty water bucket, a pitiful defense against the growing threat. He had to go outside. It was what Silas wanted, to draw him out. There was no other choice. He threw the bar off the door and burst out into the night. The fire was already licking up the dry timbers of the cabin wall, casting a hellish, dancing light across the sand. Jedediah threw the water onto the base of the flames, and it sizzled into steam, barely slowing the blaze. In that moment of exposure, a gunshot split the night. The bullet tore through the fleshy part of Jedediah's shoulder, spinning him around with its force. He grunted in pain, staggering but not falling, his own Colt already in his hand. He fired back into the darkness where the muzzle flash had been, a desperate, unaimed shot. He scrambled back inside, kicking the door shut behind him and dropping the bar. He leaned against it, panting, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his shirt. "It's over." Despair clouded his eyes. "He got me," he gasped, sliding down the door to the floor. He was wounded, his strength failing. Silas had won. "Ilara," he said, his voice strained. "The back window. The brace is loose. You can kick it out. Take the girl. Run for the rocks. Don't look back." He was sacrificing himself, trying to give them a chance, however slim. But Ilara looked at him, at this man who had become her shield, her partner, her hope, and an unshakable resolve settled in her heart. She had spent her life running from her in-laws, from starvation, from loneliness. She would not run any more. "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She laid Rose gently in the crate and picked up the heavy rifle. She had never fired a gun in her life. The weight of it was terrifying, alien. But the weight of losing this nascent family was heavier still. She strode to the front window, her fear a cold fire in her veins. She could see Silas's shadow moving in the firelight, a swaggering silhouette preparing for the final victorious approach. She rested the rifle barrel on the braced sill, just as Jedediah had shown her. She remembered his words, "Just point and pull. Don't think about it." She closed her eyes for a second, took a shaky breath, and then opened them, her gaze clear and focused. She aimed at the dark shape moving against the flames. She pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked back against her shoulder with a brutal, bruising force, the explosion deafening in the small space. Outside, the silhouette cried out, a sharp, surprised sound, and stumbled. He wasn't down, but he was hit. His triumphant advance was broken. Jedediah stared at her, his face a mixture of pain, shock, and overwhelming awe. The resilient woman he had sought to protect had just saved his life. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a warrior, fighting for her home, for her family. With a surge of adrenaline, he pushed himself up, his own gun back in his hand. They were not defeated. They were standing together. The immediate aftermath of the rifle's roar was a ringing silence. The world outside the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The fire no longer fed, sputtered and shrank, its hungry light diminishing. The swaggering shadow of Silas was gone, replaced by the sound of a horse galloping away in frantic haste, the hoofbeats fading into the vast, indifferent quiet of the desert. He was gone. The confrontation, which had loomed like a thunderhead, had broken, and the storm had passed. Ilara stood frozen at the window, the heavy rifle still clutched in her hands, its barrel smoking faintly. The recoil had left a deep, aching bruise on her shoulder, a physical testament to the line she had crossed. Then a shudder racked her body, a delayed reaction of fear and adrenaline, and the rifle clattered to the floor. She turned, her eyes wide, and looked at Jedediah. He was still slumped against the door, his face pale in the dying firelight, but he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen before, a raw, unguarded reverence. The tension that had held them all captive snapped, and the vacuum it left was filled with the mundane, urgent realities of their situation. Rose, woken by the gunshot, began to wail, a healthy, living sound that cut through the haze of violence. Jedediah's breathing was shallow, labored from the pain in his shoulder. The danger from without was vanquished, but the danger from within remained. Alara moved, her paralysis breaking. She went to Rose first, lifting her from the crate and holding her close, murmuring reassurances as she rocked her. Her daughter's solid, warm weight was an anchor, grounding her in the present. Once the baby was soothed, she turned her attention to Jedediah. "Let me see," she said, her voice regaining its steady, practical tone. She knelt beside him, her fear for him overriding any lingering shock. She carefully tore away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. The bullet had gone clean through, a blessing in this desolate place. It was bleeding freely, but the wound, while painful, was not immediately fatal. She took a clean rag one of Rose's swaddling cloths and pressed it firmly against the wound. Her touch was not the cautious, hesitant touch of a stranger. It was confident, intimate, the touch of a woman tending to her own. He flinched at the pressure, but didn't pull away. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze, all pretenses were burned away. The fire outside was gone, but a different kind of fire, one of quiet intensity, now burned between them. "You came here to rob me," she said, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact, a clearing of the final slate between them. "I did," he admitted, his voice a low rasp. "There wasn't anything to take." "There was," she countered softly, her gaze dropping to her hands, now stained with his blood as she held the compress. "You just didn't know it yet." He reached up with his good hand, his calloused fingers gently touching her jaw. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, a question and an answer all in one. "I was ready to die out here, Jedediah," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "I had given up on everything." "Not any more," he said, his thumb stroking her skin. "You and the girl. You're my stake in this world now. You're my reason." A tear she hadn't realized she was holding back traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "Ours," she corrected him, her voice a whisper. "Our reason." The word hung in the air, a vow, a foundation stone laid in the ruin of their old lives. The sun would rise soon on a world that was, for the first time, filled not with threats, but with the promise of a future they would build together. The rising sun cast a soft, forgiving light over the desert, turning the harsh landscape into a canvas of pale pinks and golds. The cabin, scorched and battered, stood as a monument to the battle they had survived. The immediate threat of Silas was gone, but the timeless threat of the desert remained. They were low on water, their food supplies were dwindling, and Jedediah was weakened by his wound. They couldn't stay. San Alvo, the mission town from Alara's note, was no longer just a destination for an orphan child. It was their collective destination, their promised land. The journey began with a quiet shared purpose. Alara, using the last of their clean water, cleaned and bandaged Jedediah's shoulder as best she could. He bore the pain with a stoic silence, his eyes watching her, tracking her every movement. She fashioned a sling for his arm from a strip of blanket, her hands efficient and gentle. He, in turn, showed her how to properly pack his horse, Dust, distributing the weight of their meager possessions for the long trek. It was a reversal of their previous roles. Where he had once been the sole, competent provider, he was now forced to rely on her strength. He leaned on her, both literally and figuratively, as they made their final preparations. She was his rock, her resilience the foundation upon which he could now rest his weariness. Leaving the cabin felt like closing a chapter. Alara took one last look at the desolate room where she had faced her deepest despair and had found her most unexpected hope. She carried Rose strapped to her chest in a makeshift sling, while Jedediah, moving stiffly, led the horse. They set out not as two desperate individuals, but as a unit, a small, determined caravan of three, moving across the vast emptiness. The journey was an ordeal. The sun was relentless, the terrain unforgiving, but it was a different kind of hardship than the one they had known before. Their solitary struggles had been colored by hopelessness and fear. This shared struggle was infused with a quiet determination. They walked side by side, their steps falling into a synchronized rhythm. When the heat was at its worst, they rested in the sparse shade of a rock outcropping, sharing precious sips of water. He would point out landmarks, teaching her the subtle language of the desert, how to read the sun, how to find the firmest ground. She, in turn, would tend to his wound, her presence a constant, soothing comfort. Rose, nestled against her mother's chest, was their compass, her vulnerability a constant reminder of what they were fighting for. She rarely cried, her wide, curious eyes taking in the endless sky and the two figures who were her entire world. The landscape, which had once seemed like an antagonist, a living entity bent on their destruction, now felt different. It was still vast and dangerous, but it was no longer malevolent. It was simply a challenge, a final trial to be overcome together. One evening, as they made camp, huddled by a small fire of sagebrush, Jedediah watched Elara humming a soft lullaby to a drowsy Rose. The sight struck him with a force greater than any bullet. He saw not a widow and an orphan he had rescued, but his family. The hole in his soul, the one carved out by the fire at Willow Creek all those years ago, was being filled. He had spent years running from his past, believing he was beyond redemption. But redemption, he was learning, wasn't something you found. It was something you built, day by day, with small acts of loyalty, care, and love. As he looked at Alara's face, illuminated by the gentle firelight, he knew he was no longer running from anything. For the first time in his life, he was walking toward something. He was walking home. 2 years can be a lifetime. It can be long enough for the memory of thirst to be washed away by the constant murmur of a running creek. It can be long enough for the scars on a man's shoulder, and a woman as heart to fade into faint, silvery lines, reminders of a battle won, not a wound that still aches. In a green valley, miles and miles from the sun-scorched wastes where their story began, a new life had taken root. The homestead wasn't large, just a sturdy cabin built of pine and river stone, with a plume of friendly smoke perpetually rising from its chimney. A small barn stood nearby, and a handful of fat cattle grazed peacefully in a meadow bordered by cottonwood trees. This was the place Jedediah and Elara had built, not from a dreamer's map, but with the sweat of their brows and the strength of their shared resolve. A small girl with hair the color of corn silk and her mother's bright, intelligent eyes took clumsy, determined steps across the porch. "Dada," she squealed, her arms outstretched. Jedediah, no longer the haunted drifter, but a man grounded and at peace, knelt down and caught his daughter in a hug. He swung her up into the air, and her laughter echoed in the clear mountain air. This was Rose, the fragile infant from the crate, now a thriving, joyful toddler, the living embodiment of their second chance. The cabin door opened, and Elara stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. The gaunt desperation was gone from her face, replaced by a serene contentment. She was carrying another child, a baby boy, nestled in the crook of her arm. She watched her husband and daughter, a soft smile playing on her lips. Jedediah caught her eye, and in that silent, shared glance, an entire history passed between them, the terror of the desert, the threat of Silas, the desperate plea in a note, the gentle carving of a wooden bird. It was a look of profound, quiet love, a love that needed no words because it had been proven in action, tested by fire, and solidified by unwavering loyalty. He walked over to her, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead, before taking the sleeping baby from her arms. He looked down at his son, then at his daughter, then at his wife, his family, his world. He remembered the man he had been, the hollow man who had ridden up to that dilapidated shack intending to steal. He had come looking for a few dollars, for supplies, for a way to keep running. He had been a thief, and in the end, he had stolen something after all. He had stolen a life he never knew he wanted, a happiness he never believed he deserved. He hadn't just found a reason to stop running. He had found a reason to stand still, to plant roots, to build. Redemption wasn't a destination like San Alvo. It was this porch, this woman, these children, this peace. What becomes of a man when the world has broken him, but a single act of compassion gives him a reason to mend? What happens when a woman who has lost everything she ever loved finds the strength to fight for a new love she never expected? The family we are born into is a matter of chance, but the family we build, the family we choose to fight for, is a testament to the most resilient and hopeful parts of the human spirit. Jedediah and Alara's story began in an ending, but they built a new beginning from the dust and ashes. What do you think of their journey? Let us know in the comments below. And if you were moved by their story of redemption and love, please remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of the families we find in the most unexpected of places.